The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began its methodical procedure: secure the site and collect every possible clue to explain how a bright young future had been so abruptly shattered. One detective later described entering the apartment and sensing a grim weight in the air, an impression that this was far more than a momentary burst of anger. The presence of certain injuries indicated resistance, that Iana had fought back at some stage. This, in turn, contradicted any theory of a simple accident or fleeting moment of anger. The nature and extent of the violence hinted at something premeditated, or at least escalated beyond what could be explained by provocation. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Los Angeles has long been a city of reinvention, drawing dreamers and strivers from every corner of the globe. Beneath the famous Hollywood sign and amidst the bustling streets, countless newcomers hope to carve out their own success stories. Against this glittering backdrop of sun-soaked boulevards and towering palm trees, a young woman named Iana arrived with aspirations that stretched far beyond the ordinary. Born on February 27, 1986 in Ukraine, Iana has always been distinguished by her exceptional determination. She studied law with a fierce dedication, hoping to help those in need and make a name for herself in a world where justice and fairness often seemed elusive. She was the kind of person who believed in thorough preparation, in analyzing every angle before making decisions that might alter the course of her life. That sense of responsibility guided her throughout her studies and eventually propelled her across the globe, where she chose to start anew in the United States, a place she had only ever seen on television or read about in magazines. From an early stage, Iana harbored a belief that a successful life could be built on an intersection of determination, kindness, and strategic planning. She learned English diligently, often watching subtitled movies and practicing pronunciation until she felt comfortable initiating casual conversations in her non-native tongue. This was no small feat, as each syllable carried with it a sense of possibility and a step closer to her goal of making a meaningful life abroad. When she finally touched down at LAX, she was not just a tourist enamored with the city's iconic landmarks, but an ambitious newcomer ready to roll up her sleeves. Although her early days in Los Angeles were spent acquainting herself with the local courts and volunteer organizations, Iana soon realized that establishing a professional foothold in a foreign legal system demanded resilience and resourcefulness. She attended workshops, explored opportunities in translation services, and networked with other immigrant communities that understood the hurdles of adapting to an entirely new environment. Through these interactions, Iana discovered a supportive circle that marveled at her optimistic disposition and straightforward sense of purpose. Despite the challenges, she saw potential everywhere. The city was as vibrant as it was daunting, and that duality invigorated her. Always meticulous, she balanced her finances on a tight budget, dedicating her off hours to studying California's laws and reading about the state's legal precedents. She reminded herself that all worthwhile goals demanded patience and that her journey had only just begun. As Iana's social circle gradually expanded, she was introduced to new acquaintances who recognized her warmth and sincerity. Among them were individuals operating in various fields, some in entertainment, some in the tech sector, and a few who dabbled in creative industries. Through a friend of a friend, she met Blake, a Canadian who came from a prominent family and carried himself with a kind of casual confidence that can be both appealing and intimidating. Rumors circulated that he had ties to wealthy circles back home, but Blake rarely flaunted that aspect of his life, preferring to talk about projects he was involved in: writing, art, even the possibility of working on a screenplay. He was the kind of person who charmed people with grand, sweeping ideas about what could be accomplished with the right mixture of passion and financial backing. To some, these were enthralling possibilities. To others, they were half-baked fantasies. Whatever the truth, there was something about Blake's optimism that resonated with Iana. Perhaps it was because they both nurtured big dreams, or maybe it was her habit of believing in the best qualities of people before passing judgment. She found herself drawn into Blake's world, a sphere that was altogether different from her legally oriented mindset. He spoke of art and storytelling as though they were living entities, conjuring images of bold narratives and striking visuals. At first, Iana thought his passion was refreshing. It reflected an unexpected synergy. While she valued structure and verifiable facts, Blake was more at ease navigating the fluid realm of imagination. Their budding friendship was further cemented by a shared curiosity about each other's backgrounds. Blake, for his part, seemed fascinated by Iana's upbringing in Eastern Europe, asking her about cultural traditions and the nuances of the Ukrainian legal system. She responded with patient, thoughtful explanations, appreciating his effort to understand her roots. Yet beneath the polished surface, Iana sometimes sensed a subtle darkness in his imagination that she couldn't fully articulate. Nevertheless, the gravitational pull of two contrasting perspectives, her devotion to order and justice, his affinity for artistic chaos, laid the foundation for an unlikely alliance. Before long, rumors of a possible romantic relationship began to surface. Friends whispered about the seemingly mismatched pair, speculating whether the relationship would last or if it was merely a passing attraction born from life in a bustling metropolis that devours fleeting connections. Still, Iana and Blake maintained their own version of normalcy. When she told him about her dream of building a career, he would nod in empathetic support, sometimes even offering to introduce her to people in his network who might help her find more meaningful work. By all accounts, Blake presented himself as a creative soul with philanthropic tendencies, a person who claimed to understand the hardships that hamper success in a competitive environment. She occasionally received calls from her relatives in Ukraine who were eager to hear about the progress she was making. Whenever she spoke of Blake during these conversations, she would highlight his imaginative side, carefully selecting positive anecdotes that showed him in a good light. For the most part, her family expressed relief that Iana had found someone who appreciated her, even if they remained understandably cautious about the uncertainties that come with cross-cultural relationships in a distant land. Yet there were moments when Iana found herself pausing to consider subtle changes in Blake's demeanor. At times, he would exhibit bursts of anxiety, and certain topics seemed to unnerve him. If she probed too deeply into his creative influences or the darkness that underpinned some of his artistic works, he would brush off the conversation or steer it elsewhere. She usually attributed this to artistic temperament, convincing herself that such behavior was not unusual for people immersed in imaginative projects. Moreover, no glaring warning signs emerged during their early interactions, no open threats or indisputable evidence of malice. Instead, their dynamic revolved around shared ambitions and the comforting notion that they could both flourish in the sprawling maze that is Los Angeles. Just as Iana started to feel more grounded, a few of her acquaintances gently questioned the stability of her relationship with Blake. They cautioned her to remain vigilant, explaining that the city was a magnet for people with fluid personalities, some truly talented, others simply chasing illusions. An undercurrent of whispers suggested that Blake's finances and background might be more complicated than they seemed, riddled with familial expectations and unresolved tensions. Though Iana listened, she chose not to jump to negative conclusions. She was in the habit of granting people the benefit of the doubt, a habit that sometimes served her well in mediating conflicts but could also blind her to potential red flags. In that sense, Iana was living a carefully balanced life, juggling her aspirations in law, familial responsibilities, and a growing relationship that seemed both promising and perplexing. Little did anyone suspect that beneath the surface of what appeared to be a promising partnership, harrowing secrets would one day come to light. Looking back, friends and family looked for signs they might have missed. How could something that started out so positively end in such a terrible tragedy? In the weeks leading up to the moment that would forever alter countless lives, everyday routines seemed deceptively ordinary for those who knew Iana and Blake. Outwardly, they continued to frequent their favorite cafes, talk animatedly about their plans, and share moments of apparent normalcy with friends. However, a subtle tension had begun to infiltrate their home life. Those closest to Iana noticed that her usual confidence sometimes wavered, and she seemed reluctant to discuss certain aspects of her relationship. For all the optimism that had once defined her, there were now occasional hints of fear in her eyes. At times, she would brush off her friend's concerns with a nervous laugh, as though reluctant to delve too deeply into her private anxieties. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant and level-headed, so perhaps she thought she could manage or de-escalate whatever conflicts arose. Meanwhile, Blake, still outwardly friendly, began to show erratic behavior. He would occasionally withdraw from gatherings without explanation or respond irritably to questions about his work. Certain acquaintances who had initially admired him for his creative streak now confessed that they felt uneasy in his presence. There was no single dramatic incident to provide clarity. Rather, a series of small, disquieting developments that collectively hinted at turmoil beneath the couple's carefully maintained surface. During this period, one of Iana's close friends, who occasionally stayed in contact via late-night phone calls, recalled a specific conversation in which Iana sounded torn. She seemed eager to discuss professional opportunities, perhaps a chance at a paralegal position with a local firm, but she hesitated to share details about her personal life. When her friend gently prodded, suggesting that perhaps Iana needed time away from Blake, she abruptly changed the subject. In the retelling of that conversation later, the friend admitted that while she sensed Iana's worry, she never would have imagined the harrowing events that would eventually unfold. Hindsight, of course, imparts a grim clarity that day-to-day life often disguises. Even if Iana had begun to detect that something was amiss, it is equally plausible that she believed the issues could be resolved through patience and understanding. After all, she had navigated challenges her entire life, from acclimating to a new culture in Los Angeles to financially supporting herself through a wide variety of side jobs. Why should her relationship be any different? Not long after, neighbors in the West Hollywood apartment building reported hearing sharp disagreements emanating from behind closed doors. At first, the disturbances were chalked up to typical couples' quarrels, tense enough to rattle the walls, but not so extreme as to suggest imminent danger. The building, nestled in a vibrant neighborhood, was no stranger to the clamor of everyday life. Blaring television sets, late-night parties, or impassioned arguments that tapered off with the dawn. For most residents, the occasional raised voices never inspired more than mild annoyance. Still, over time, there were instances when people who lived near Iana and Blake mentioned hearing disturbing snippets, angry, unsteady tones, and what might have been pleas for calm. One neighbor admitted, in a hushed conversation with other tenants, that she sometimes wondered whether something sinister was brewing in the apartment across the hall. Yet, in a city as large and diverse as Los Angeles, it can be easy to assume that other people's disputes are not one's business. Speculation remained just that. Whispers of worry, easily overshadowed by the bustle of everyday obligations. Amid these growing concerns, Iana found herself increasingly isolated. Some friends noticed she was less available for casual get-togethers or group lunches. When she did appear, she looked exhausted, as though burdened by intangible worries. Uncharacteristically, she would rush home instead of lingering in conversation. In a journal entry recovered later, she had scribbled short notes to herself, reminding herself to be strong, to focus on her goals. Despite the ominous atmosphere closing in around her, she still believed in rational solutions, possibly because of her legal training and her innate inclination to see the best in people. It was that trait, her deep-seated conviction that dialogue and patience could solve almost anything, that would, in a tragic irony, contribute to her vulnerability. If friends pressed her for updates, she reassured them in a measured tone that she was doing her best to handle personal matters and that nothing warranted serious alarm. Precisely when the tension between them tipped from verbal discord to the threat of physical harm is not something that can be pinpointed with complete accuracy. What became increasingly clear is that Blake's creative musings began to intersect with a darker strain of thinking. He had apparently immersed himself in unsettling stories and artwork that, to certain observers, bordered on the macabre. Though he rarely spoke about these themes in polite company, glimpses of them surfaced in snippets of conversation, brief mentions of violent imagery in graphic novels, disturbing storyboards that took shape late at night. It was never enough to trigger immediate alarm. After all, many artists explore unsettling themes as part of their craft. But in the context of Blake's increasingly fragile emotional state, these fascinations hinted at a more disturbing undercurrent that Iana either overlooked or believed she could help him manage. The final day that friends or neighbors recall seeing Iana alive was marked by a seemingly mundane routine. She left the apartment early in the morning to pick up some groceries and returned shortly thereafter, exchanging polite nods with a tenant in the elevator. According to him, she looked unusually tense, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as though expecting an unpleasant surprise. When night fell, however, some residents reported an abrupt commotion. A single piercing cry, quickly muffled, then nothing. The hush that followed was deeply unsettling. The exact timeline of events inside that apartment remains partially obscured by conflicting statements and the chaos that followed. What is definitively known is that something dreadful transpired late into the night, culminating in a scene so disturbing that first responders would later describe it as one of the most distressing they had ever encountered. A sense of panic pervaded the small, meticulously furnished living space, suggesting that a struggle had unfolded in multiple rooms. Certain items were scattered in a way that indicated an attempt to resist or escape. The few glimpses made public in official reports alluded to signs of violence and trauma. Yet it was equally clear that Iana's final ordeal occurred with no immediate neighbors intervening or even fully comprehending the danger. That fact would later haunt many people, fueling a collective sorrow that they had not realized the severity of the threat. Only in the early hours of the following morning did concerned parties begin to mobilize. Iana's mother, who had been unable to reach her daughter by phone, made repeated attempts to call or text, growing increasingly anxious with each unanswered ring. By mid-morning, her panic escalated to the point where she reached out to one of Iana's closest friends, urging her to check the apartment. Meanwhile, that same friend had received a baffling message from Blake's phone, its tone abrupt and vaguely dismissive. Sensing that something was seriously amiss, the friend tried to contact building management and a decision was made to place an urgent call to the police. Officers arrived on scene shortly thereafter, but they initially faced resistance in accessing the apartment. Accounts diverge on whether Blake himself refused to open the door or whether it was simply locked and barricaded from inside. When law enforcement finally set foot in the apartment, the gravity of what they discovered confirmed their worst fears. By then, the area had been cordoned off, and additional units were deployed to secure the perimeter. The disturbing reality soon became clear. There would be no rescue, no revival, no flurry of urgent medical interventions that could alter the outcome. Iana Kassian was found deceased, her body bearing evidence of a horrifying end. News of Iana's death leaked out into the community with startling speed. Within a matter of hours, texts and calls flashed from phone to phone, each person reacting with shock, confusion, or disbelief. The question on everyone's mind was how such a tragedy could have erupted behind the doors of two individuals who had, in many respects, seemed fairly ordinary, perhaps even enviable. Iana's professional dreams, her warm personality, and her willingness to help others were well known among her acquaintances. While there were inklings of trouble, few imagined that those troubles would escalate into something so devastating. Blake was taken into custody at the scene, but the details surrounding his state of mind, his explanations, or his reactions were kept tightly under wraps. The police, citing the high-profile nature of the case, restricted public statements to only the broadest of confirmations: that a homicide had occurred, that a suspect was in custody, and that the preliminary investigation strongly pointed to him as the perpetrator. Amid this frenzy, Iana's family and friends struggled to come to terms with the loss, exchanging messages of grief and heartbreak over the abrupt end to a life that had once radiated such promise. In the days that followed, authorities provided limited official updates, stating that more information would emerge as the case progressed. They acknowledged that the victim and suspect had a history together, but they refrained from disclosing definitive motives or the precise nature of what had led to the final confrontation. Of course, rumors circulated, fueled by online speculation and neighbors recounting every snippet of noise they might have heard through the walls in the preceding weeks. For many, the immediate reaction was simply disbelief that someone as gentle, studious, and community-minded as Iana could have been subjected to a fate so violent. As the shock subsided enough for people to reflect, certain patterns emerged in what they recalled of the couple's dynamic. While the narrative of a troubled relationship was only partially formed before the tragedy, posthumous recollections now took on added significance, with each uneasy memory or piece of anecdotal evidence magnified. Some recalled fleeting instances of control, a disapproving glance from Blake when Iana spoke too freely, or his reluctance to let her socialize without him. Others remembered that some of his artistic works bordered on violence, though they had never before made a direct connection between his creative life and any real danger. All of these threads, once woven into a tapestry of speculation, formed the underpinnings of the central question. Why would a young man from a well-to-do background, who ostensibly had every advantage, commit an act so severe? And why would such a bright, ambitious person like Iana remain in a situation that even faintly suggested peril? In the hours following the discovery of Iana's body, waves of law enforcement officials, forensic specialists, and emergency responders converged on the West Hollywood apartment. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began its methodical procedure: secure the site and collect every possible clue to explain how a bright young future had been so abruptly shattered. One detective later described entering the apartment and sensing a grim weight in the air, an impression that this was far more than a momentary burst of anger. Per standard protocol, investigators moved quickly to preserve all evidence. Crime scene photographers documented every room, each piece of furniture, and any trace of disruption. Forensic technicians followed, bagging items that might later prove crucial in reconstructing Iana's final hours. Fibers, smudges, and other minute details were gathered for lab tests. Detectives knew that the simplest imprint or overlooked stain could become essential if the suspect's account failed to align with the physical facts. They methodically labeled and stored everything with the understanding that every thread of evidence counted. Police escorted Blake to a patrol car for questioning. Onlookers noted he seemed disoriented, neither overtly resisting nor showing overt emotion. At the station, detectives began the formal interrogation process. Insiders would later mention that his statements shifted repeatedly, alternating between sorrow and evasiveness. Over hours of questioning, the inconsistencies in his version of events multiplied. Yet investigators could not rush to judgment. They were determined to cross-check each claim with the physical evidence. Facts had to be unassailable, because any error might jeopardize the case if it reached a courtroom. While that interrogation unfolded, medical examiners prepared to conduct an autopsy, a vital procedure to confirm the cause and manner of Iana's death. The final report would remain sealed for some time, but detectives were privately briefed. Their suspicions that this was more than a spontaneous altercation hardened into near certainty. Iana's injuries indicated a profound level of violence. However, the question still loomed: what had triggered it? Seeking a fuller picture, investigators turned to Iana's friends, co-workers, and relatives. They uncovered a mosaic of perspectives. One friend described a phone call in which Iana downplayed personal conflicts while sounding far from her usual self. Another recalled that Blake's artwork delved into disturbing territory, though few had linked it to real-life aggression. A former colleague of Blake's noted that he could be charismatic one moment, withdrawn the next. Yet no single person had foreseen this explosive tragedy. As the detective team pieced everything together, it appeared that tension had been building behind the scenes, likely unknown to all but the couple themselves. Parallel to this, investigators reviewed any potential outside motives. Could someone else have wanted to harm Iana? Or was this purely a domestic situation? Meanwhile, the painstaking gathering of evidence continued. Lab technicians compared DNA samples, tested for substances, and analyzed every fiber under microscopic scrutiny. Detectives reconstructed a timeline of Iana's final day. Her morning routine, any stops she made, and the approximate time she returned home. Security cameras from adjacent buildings were scrutinized frame by frame, capturing a few unclear glimpses but nothing definitive. Perhaps a silhouette crossing a courtyard, the distant rumble of a car's engine. Still, these bits of data, combined with phone records, painted an increasingly damning picture of who had been present when things went horribly wrong. Discrepancies in Blake's statements carried significant weight. If he said he was asleep at a certain hour but a video clip suggested someone moving about the apartment, it might indicate deception. Experienced detectives know that murder cases seldom hinge on a single dramatic gotcha moment. Instead, they revolve around a meticulous web of confirmations and contradictions. Here, each piece of forensic evidence formed a link in the chain that was steadily encircling the suspect's account. Seasoned detectives recognized a narrative pattern they had encountered before: Though no two cases are identical, a relationship that appeared outwardly stable but was undercut by tension, culminating in violence that outsiders rarely predict. While sensational headlines focused on Blake's purported wealth or the darkness in some of his graphic writings, investigators focused on verifying facts and motivations. They gathered any notes, text messages, or emails that might illuminate the couple's dynamic. Days turned into weeks, then months, as experts pored over the most minute evidence. Investigators had one goal above all else: ensure that when charges were brought, the case would stand on an unshakable foundation. As the forensic data trickled back, it confirmed key suspicions. The presence of certain injuries indicated resistance, that Iana had fought back at some stage. This, in turn, contradicted any theory of a simple accident or fleeting moment of anger. The nature and extent of the violence hinted at something premeditated, or at least escalated beyond what could be explained by provocation. Step by step, the lead detective prepared the case file for the district attorney's office. The file was massive, stacked with transcripts of witness statements, forensic lab results, and lengthy investigative notes. Each item was carefully cross-referenced with timelines and diagrams, ensuring that no detail would be overlooked. They understood that a drawn-out trial could be inevitable. Blake's defense would likely challenge everything from the validity of DNA testing to the interpretation of Iana's injuries. Eventually, the official charges were filed: murder in the first degree, among additional counts that reflected the severity of the assault. When the trial date finally arrived, the courtroom in downtown Los Angeles became a focal point for reporters, legal observers, and community members still reeling from the horrendous details of Iana Cassian's death. Before the jury, the prosecutors presented itemized evidence meticulously gathered during the investigation. Evidence logs detailed the exact locations of fibers, the significance of bloodstain patterns, and the presence of injuries strongly suggesting that Iana had fought for her life. The state's forensic experts testified that the marks found around the scene were consistent with a struggle extending well beyond a single flash of anger. Crucially, the prosecutors delved into the timeline. They asserted that phone records showed Iana had made her last text to a friend earlier in the evening, mentioning that she felt uneasy, but insisting she would handle the situation. Testimony about video footage from neighboring buildings was also introduced. While the footage had not captured a perfectly clear sequence of events, it recorded that no one else had entered or exited the complex in the critical time frame. According to the state, this left only one possible suspect. Though the defense would later question whether the footage was conclusive, the prosecution used it to bolster the argument that no third party could have carried out the crime, then vanished without a trace. Another critical component of the state's case involved the psychological underpinnings that could motivate such brutality. While they did not dwell on sensationalized depictions of Blake's art or writing, the prosecutors did note that some of his creative projects contained extreme themes, overlapping with violent imagery. They called on an expert who carefully explained that while dark artistic expression alone does not prove intent to kill, it can signal a mindset more receptive to aggression, especially when combined with other risk factors, such as emotional instability or erratic behavior. The expert never outright stated that reading or writing about violence precipitates homicide. Rather, they framed it as one potential element among many that might shape a suspect's worldview. Combined with the ample physical evidence, the prosecution argued that these details formed a mosaic of premeditated malice. When the defense took the floor, a starkly different narrative emerged. Their opening statement acknowledged the horror of Iana's death, but claimed that Blake's involvement was not as unequivocal as the state alleged. They implied that perhaps an unknown assailant had entered the apartment, capitalizing on what they described as a volatile but not murderous environment. Alternatively, they floated the possibility that an unforeseen confrontation spiraled out of control in a moment of emotional duress. The defense pointed to the absence of eyewitnesses who could definitively say they saw Blake commit the act. Experts for the defense came forward to argue alternate theories about the evidence. They attempted to interpret certain blood spatter patterns as inconclusive, rather than definitive proof of an extended struggle. They also questioned the reliability of some forms of forensic testing, noting that human error in labs is not unheard of. Yet these arguments often faltered against the prosecution's robust accumulation of cross-reference data. For instance, if one piece of evidence could be contested, another would underscore the same conclusion. It became increasingly clear that the defense struggled to neutralize the totality of findings that consistently pointed toward one possible scenario: that Iana's final moments had been shaped by a single attacker whose identity was difficult to deny. Midway through the trial, the tone shifted as the prosecution called on Iana's close friends and relatives. Their testimonies introduced a powerful emotional current in the courtroom. Blake himself took the stand late in the trial, a choice many observers found surprising, as defense attorneys often prefer to shield their client from the risks of cross-examination. Appearing composed yet somber, he claimed that he had loved Iana and had never intended to harm her. He offered vague explanations for the inconsistencies in his earlier statements, attributing them to panic, confusion, and shock at discovering her lifeless body. At one point, he broke down in tears, insisting that he had simply lost his memory of the crucial time frame due to stress or trauma. The cross-examination by the prosecution was relentless, as they presented each contradictory element from his interrogations and evidence from the crime scene, asking him directly to account for each discrepancy. More than once, he stumbled over an explanation, appearing cornered by the sheer mass of physical clues that contradicted his versions of events. By the end of his testimony, some courtroom observers remarked that his display of emotion, whether genuine or contrived, lacked the consistency needed to sway the jury. Finally, the jury retired and spent 2 full days reviewing documents, asking for clarification on certain pieces of evidence, and reviewing transcripts of key testimony. On the 3rd day, the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. The jury returned to their seats and read aloud the verdict. Blake Liebel was guilty of first-degree murder. At the formal sentencing hearing a few weeks later, the judge noted the brutality of the crime and the apparent lack of remorse. Based on the weight of the evidence and the unanimous verdict of the jury, the court rendered its final verdict: life in prison without the possibility of parole.